The first thing Diane Parker asked me was whether her daughter was alive. Not where she was, not why the doors were locked, not why her phone had disappeared from her purse, not why her husband was sitting 10 feet away with his wrists secured to the arms of an antique wooden chair. She looked directly at me and asked, "Is Elise alive?" That was how I knew she had been waiting 8 years for someone to answer that question. I stood behind my easel and dipped the edge of my brush into a pool of gray paint. Across from me sat 4 people: Diane and Gregory Parker, Thomas and Rebecca Callahan, 2 married couples who had never met before that afternoon. At least, that was what they believed. The studio was an old converted warehouse outside Portland, Oregon. Brick walls, tall windows, concrete floor. Enough space that every sound seemed to linger longer than it should. Rain tapped against the glass. Behind me stood a canvas almost 7 feet wide. Blank, except for several dark lines I had already drawn. Thomas Callahan pulled against the leather strap around his wrist again. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," I continued painting. Thomas had spent 26 years as a prosecutor. His silver hair was cut perfectly. His suit probably cost more than my first car. Even tied to a chair, he managed to look offended rather than frightened. "You drugged us," he said. "You restrained us. This is kidnapping." "No," I said. He stared at me. I considered it. "All right. Technically, yes." Rebecca made a soft nose beside him. Gregory Parker leaned forward. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you. You offered us $25,000. I did. For a portrait, yes." Diane was still watching me. "Is Elise alive?" I wiped my brush against a cloth. "No." The word barely left my mouth before her face changed. Gregory closed his eyes. Rebecca turned away. Thomas stopped pulling at the restraints. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Diane whispered, "You're lying." "I wish I were." She shook her head. "Elise ran away. That is what Red Hollow told you." Her eyes snapped toward mine. And there it was, the reason all 4 of them were sitting in my studio. I smiled without warmth. "Good. You remember the name." Thomas went pale. Rebecca's breathing became shallow. Gregory stared at the floor. I turned back to the canvas. "Then we can begin." 8 years earlier, Elise Parker was 16 years old. If you had met her at 12, you probably would have described her as shy. If you had met her at 14, you might have called her anxious. By 16, adults had found a better word: difficult. Adults love words like that. Difficult, defiant, unmotivated, manipulative. They are efficient words. They save people from asking inconvenient questions. Elise lived in a large house in a quiet suburb. Her mother, Diane, taught English at one of the best public high schools in the county. Students adored her. Parents requested her classes. Every spring, somebody nominated Diane Parker for another teaching award. Her office at home had a shelf filled with plaques. Teacher of the Year, Excellence in Education, Community Leadership Award. There were photographs of former students standing beside Diane at graduations. Letters thanking her, parents writing that she had changed their children's lives. Diane knew exactly how to inspire teenagers, except one, her own daughter. Elise wasn't stupid, that matters. She wasn't lazy either. But she was slower than Diane wanted her to be. An assignment that took another student an hour might take Elise 3. She could spend an entire evening preparing for a chemistry exam and still get a B-. To most parents, a B- is a grade. To Diane Parker, it was evidence. Evidence that Elise hadn't worked hard enough. Evidence that she was wasting her potential. Evidence that something had to be corrected. Diane created schedules. Study hours, tutoring, no phone after dinner. No weekends with friends until homework was finished. If Elise brought home a B, they discussed why it wasn't an A. If she brought home an A-, they discussed the missing percentage points. If she brought home an A, Diane asked whether the test had been too easy. Gregory Parker rarely participated. That was his gift, absence. He worked in corporate finance and traveled often. When he was home and Diane argued with Elise, Gregory usually sat at the kitchen island reading emails. Sometimes Elise looked at him, waiting. He would eventually say, "Your mother only wants what's best for you," then return to his phone. At 15, Elise stopped sleeping properly. At 15 and a half, she started missing school. At 16, she began locking herself in her bedroom for hours at a time. Diane interpreted each change as rebellion. Gregory interpreted it as something Diane would handle. Then Elise's grades collapsed. Diane's patience went with them. One Tuesday morning, Elise refused to leave her bedroom. Diane took the door off its hinges. That evening, Gregory finally admitted they needed outside help. A counselor recommended a residential program for troubled teenagers. The brochure arrived 3 days later. There was a photograph of pine-covered mountains on the front. Teenagers hiking beside smiling counselors, a wooden lodge, a campfire. Underneath the picture were 3 words: discipline, accountability, growth. The place was called Red Hollow Youth Center. Diane read every page of the brochure. She liked what she saw. Small groups, individual counseling, outdoor education, academic recovery, structured discipline. The program promised to restore healthy family dynamics and rebuild responsible young adults. Gregory looked at the price. Nearly $12,000 a month. If it works, Diane said, it's worth it. They drove Elise there on a Thursday. It took almost 4 hours. The last 40 minutes were along a narrow road through mountain forest. Elise spent the entire drive asking where they were going. Diane told her it was a therapeutic school. When they reached the gate, Elise saw the 12-foot fence. That was when she started crying. Not screaming, not fighting, just crying. Gregory wouldn't look at her. A counselor came outside, tall man, broad shoulders, red hollow polo shirt. His name was Derek Schott. He shook Gregory's hand. Called Diane ma'am. Then he told Elise to hand over her shoes. She looked at her mother. Mom. Diane nodded. Do what he says. Why? This is going to help you. I don't want to stay here. Elise, please. Diane's expression hardened. We've tried everything. Elise grabbed her mother's arm. Derek stepped between them. Separation anxiety is normal. No. Elise said. Mom, please. Diane got back into the car. Gregory followed. Elise stood behind the gate. The last thing Diane saw before they drove away was her daughter pounding both hands against the metal fence. Diane's chair scraped across my studio floor. Stop. I looked up. She was crying now. I don't know who told you that. You did. Her brow tightened. Not to me. I added another line to the canvas. You told the Red Hollow intake counselor. It was in Elise's file. Gregory finally looked directly at me. How did you get those records? I ignored him. Diane swallowed. What happened to her? We're getting there. You said she was dead. Yes. Then tell me what happened. No. Her face twisted. What? You've waited 8 years. You can wait another hour. Thomas muttered something under his breath. I looked toward him. Mr. Callahan. He stared back. This is sick. Probably. You think you're punishing us? No. What do you call this? I considered the question. A portrait session. He laughed once. There was no humor in it. I returned to my painting. Elise lasted 11 days before she called home. Dan froze. She called us several times. 3 times. No. Yes. Diane shook her head. Not 3. 3. You don't know that. June 17th. June 23rd. July 2nd. Her lips parted. I could see her searching her memory. The first call lasted for minutes and 12 seconds. Elise told her mother she hated the program. Diane reminded her that change was uncomfortable. The second call lasted 2 minutes. Elise said she wasn't sleeping. Diane told her to cooperate with the staff. The third call lasted 53 seconds. That was the call Diane remembered. Because Elise didn't complain about food, or school, or chores. She whispered, "Mom, please come get me." Then she started crying. Diane asked what happened. Before Elise could answer, another voice appeared. A staff member, calm, professional. He explained that Elise was in what Red Hollow called a resistance cycle. He said some residents exaggerated conditions to regain control over their families. He used clinical words: manipulation, boundary testing, behavioral escalation. Diane listened. The staff member asked her an important question. "If you rescue her every time she becomes uncomfortable, Mrs. Parker, what lesson are you teaching her?" Diane had no answer, so she did nothing. "Elise called 3 times, I said." Diane stared at the floor. "You could have picked her up." "I didn't know. You knew she wanted to leave. That isn't the same." "No." I looked at her. "It isn't, and that was the problem." Brooke Callahan arrived at Red Hollow 6 weeks after Elise. Brooke was 17. If Elise's instinct was to disappear whenever adults became angry, Brooke's instinct was to make them angrier, she argued. She skipped class. She climbed out of her bedroom window after midnight. She had been suspended twice, once for fighting, once for telling a vice principal exactly what she thought of him. Her father, Thomas Callahan, considered every incident a personal humiliation. Thomas had built his life around reputation. He prosecuted violent criminals, appeared on local television, spoke at charity events. He had spent decades becoming the kind of man people recognized in grocery stores. Then his teenage daughter started getting brought home by police. He couldn't tolerate it. Rebecca tried to explain that Brooke had been different since her older brother left for college. Thomas called that an excuse. Rebecca suggested therapy. Thomas arranged therapy. Brooke refused to speak. Thomas enrolled her in another program. Brooke walked out. Then someone in his professional circle mentioned Red Hollow. Thomas researched it. He found positive testimonials, success stories, photographs of smiling families. He also found something else, a complaint filed by a former employee. Allegations of physical mistreatment, improper restraint, isolation. Thomas knew how accusations worked. Anyone could make them. The complaint had gone nowhere. No criminal charges, no successful lawsuit. Nothing that mattered, so he ignored it. Rebecca did not know about the complaint, not then. Thomas signed the paperwork. Brooke learned she was going to Red Hollow when 2 transport agents entered her bedroom at 5 in the morning. She fought them. Thomas stood in the hallway. Rebecca cried. Brooke screamed at both of them. She promised she would never forgive them. The transport agents placed her in the back seat of an SUV. Thomas watched the vehicle disappear. Then he went inside and made coffee. "You're lying." Thomas's voice was quieter now. I looked over my shoulder. "Which part?" "I never saw any complaint. You opened it from your office computer." His jaw tightened. "That's impossible." March 14th, 9:17 p.m. Rebecca turned toward her husband. "What complaint?" Thomas didn't answer. I smiled slightly. "That comes later." Rebecca stared at him. "What complaint, Tom?" "Don't. You knew there were accusations?" I said don't. Her face changed. "Not fear. Something colder," I continued. Brooke met Elise during her first week. For the first time that afternoon, I stopped pretending I wasn't part of the story. There were 3 of us. Nobody moved. I put down my brush. Elise Parker. I looked at Diane, Brooke Callahan, then Thomas. And me. Rebecca whispered, "Oh my God, my name is Noah Whitaker." No one spoke. I was 16 when my father sent me to Red Hollow. My father hated my paintings, not because they were bad. He would have understood that. He hated them because I cared about them. My father believed every boat should have a certain shape: football, cars, girls, confidence, a loud voice, a firm handshake. I liked quiet rooms, old movies, charcoal pencils, old paint. I hated sports. I was skinny. I got nervous around strangers when I was 14. A group of beaus at school started calling me princess. My father heard about it. For him, that was worse than if I had been failing every class. He tried to fix me: gym membership, boxing, outdoor camps. He once threw away every sketchbook in my bedroom. When none of it worked, he found Red Hollow. "They'll toughen you up," that was what he said. My first day there, Derek Shaw asked why I thought my father had sent me. I said, "Because he doesn't like me." Derek smiled. Wrong answer. At Red Hollow, there was always a correct answer. You weren't homesick. You were dependent. You weren't scared. You were resistant. You weren't angry. You lacked accountability. And if you said the staff had hurt you, that was manipulation. Words became cages. Once they had enough words for you, anything they did could be justified. Dr. Malcolm Voss was the director. He rarely raised his voice. That was what made him effective. Terrence loved him. He wore soft sweaters, kept family photographs on his desk. He talked about trauma-informed care and personal responsibility. When parents visited, he called every student young man or young lady. After the parents left, Derek Shaw ran the place. We woke at 5:30, beds inspected at 5:40. Physical training at 6, classes, work assignments, group sessions, more physical training. Silence during meals unless staff gave permission to speak. Breaking rules meant extra work. Arguing meant isolation. Trying to run meant something worse. The system wasn't designed to teach you anything. It was designed to make resistance exhausting. Elise understood that quickly. She became invisible. She followed rules, kept her eyes down, answered questions exactly how staff wanted. I thought she was weak. Then one night she slipped half a granola bar under my blanket because I had missed dinner as punishment. That was Elise, terrified of everything, still willing to risk punishment because somebody else was hungry. Brooke arrived later. She lasted approximately 6 minutes before telling Derek Shaw to go to hell. We heard about it before we met her. By dinner, she was famous. Brooke refused to apologize, refused to repeat the program's scripted statements, refused to admit her parents had saved her. When a counselor asked what she wanted to learn at Red Hollow, Brooke said, "How to sue this place." I laughed so hard I nearly got punished with her. That was how we became friends. The three of us were terrible at surviving in different ways. Elise survived by disappearing. Brooke survived by fighting. I survived by watching. Eventually we became good enough at all three. Red Hollow had an old maintenance building behind the dormitories. Students weren't allowed near it. Brooke became obsessed with it. She noticed counselors going inside late at night. She noticed an old pickup leaving the property at strange hours. Mostly she noticed names. There was a board in the administrative hallway listing residents. Every few months, somebody disappeared from the board. Staff always said the student had completed the program or had been transferred. At first, we believed them. Then Brooke started writing down names. 17 in 1 year, she asked around. Nobody remembered farewell meetings. Nobody saw parents arrive. Nobody saw suitcases. The students simply vanished. One afternoon Brooke found a stack of shredded paperwork in an office trash bin. Most of it was useless. One strip had a name. Another had the phrase, "Incident Review." Another contained 3 words, "Reservoir Access Road." Brooke showed them to me that night. I think something happened. Obviously, no. Something worse. Elise whispered, "Stop." Brooke looked at her. "We need proof. We need to survive. We need both." Elise started crying. Brooke immediately softened. She reached across the floor and took Elise's hand. "We're getting out. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." "How?" "I don't know yet." Then Brooke looked at both of us. "But one of us will." She made us promise. If one of us escaped Red Hollow, that person would tell somebody. Police, reporters, parents, anybody. "If one gets out," she said, "we tell everyone." We promised. 2 weeks later, Brooke disappeared. I stopped speaking. The rain outside the studio had grown heavier. Diane's makeup had run beneath her eyes. Rebecca had both hands clenched into fists. Thomas looked straight ahead. Gregory still hadn't said anything. Rebecca finally asked, "What happened to Brooke?" I looked at Thomas. "He knows part of it." Thomas jerked toward me. "I don't know anything. You visited Red Hollow 3 days before she disappeared." Rebecca stared at him. "What?" Thomas shook his head. "No. September 22nd. I visited several times." "No, you attended a private meeting." "That's bullshit. Dr. Voss called you because Brooke had accused a staff member of assault." Thomas stopped breathing for a second. Rebecca's face emptied. "What did he just say?" Thomas looked at his wife, Becky. "What did he just say?" "He's manipulating you." I almost laughed. "Interesting word." Rebecca looked back at me. "Tell me." So I did. Brooke had reported Derek Shaw. She told staff he had hurt her during isolation. Red Hollow couldn't completely ignore the accusation because of Thomas's profession. So Dr. Voss called him. Thomas drove up alone. He interviewed his own daughter as if she were a witness he didn't trust. Brooke begged him to take her home. Thomas asked why she had waited to report it. Brooke said she was afraid. Thomas asked whether she understood what an accusation like that could do to a person's life. Brooke screamed at him. Dr. Voss explained that troubled teenagers sometimes made accusations against authority figures. Thomas already knew that. He had prosecuted cases where children lie. He had also prosecuted cases where adults did. He chose the interpretation that required the least disruption. He left Brooke at Red Hollow. 3 days later, she vanished. Rebecca was shaking. "You never told me." Thomas said nothing. "You told me she was improving." "Nothing." "You went there, Rebecca. You saw her." He lowered his head, and there it was, not confession, not exactly. Something more useful, shame. Elise disappeared for days after Brooke. Staff said her parents had withdrawn her. I knew that was impossible. Elise had spent weeks begging to go home. If her parents had actually arrived, every student in the dorm would have heard her crying with relief. Instead, her bed was simply empty one morning. Her name disappeared from the board. Derek told me not to ask questions, so I started asking more. I found Brooke's shoe near the maintenance trail. One sneaker, mud dried along the sole. There was a dark stain near the laces. I hid it. That night I decided to leave. I failed. Derek caught me at the outer fence. They put me in isolation for 4 days. By the second day, I couldn't tell whether I was awake. By the fourth, I told them everything they wanted to hear. I was manipulative. I was ungrateful. My father had saved me. Red Hollow was helping me. Derek smiled. "See, you're learning." Something in me changed that week. Brooke fought. Elise disappeared. I learned patience. For the next 3 months, I became the best student Red Hollow had ever seen. I followed every rule. I volunteered. I apologized. Dr. Voss told my father I had made extraordinary progress. Then one January morning, a snowstorm knocked power out across the property. Backup generators failed in one building. Electronic locks disengaged. I walked out through a service corridor wearing a maintenance jacket. Nobody noticed for 28 minutes. By then I was 2 miles into the forest. I didn't stop until night. When police found me, Red Hollow told them I wasn't stable. My father agreed. I told officers about Brooke, about Elise, about the maintenance road, about the missing students. They asked for evidence. I had a shoe. A frightened teenager with a shoe isn't evidence. Red Hollow produced documentation showing Brooke and Elise had been discharged into parental custody. The signatures looked real. The investigation ended. My father brought me home. 3 weeks later, I disappeared again. This time voluntarily. I never went back. Gregory finally spoke. "If you knew all of this, why wait 8 years?" Because nobody believed a 16-year-old. And now I have evidence. Thomas laughed bitterly. "You think a recording of us sitting here will prove a murder?" "No. I looked toward the canvas. The dead will do that. Diane made a choking sound. What does that mean? Instead of answering, I walked to a small table near the window. 4 folders lay there. I placed one in front of each parent. Diane couldn't reach hers with her hands secure, so I opened it. Inside were copies of emails, bank records, staff schedules, internal reports, photographs. Gregory stared at one email longer than the others. I noticed, recognized that. He said nothing. 2 months after Elise entered Red Hollow, a former employee emailed you. Diane turned toward her husband. What? The email described illegal restraint, isolation, medical neglect. Gregory had replied once, "Thank you for your concern. We will discuss this with the program." He never did. Why? Diane whispered. Gregory's voice cracked. I called. No, you didn't. I called the office. You called Red Hollow. Yes. You asked the people being accused whether they were abusing our daughter. I didn't know what else to do. You could have driven there. He stared at her. Diane began crying again. I felt no satisfaction. That surprised me. For years, had imagined this moment, parents discovering what their choices had done. I expected something, relief, justice, maybe pleasure. Instead they looked smaller than I remembered. Just for aging people sitting in chairs, that didn't make them innocent. It only made them ordinary, and perhaps that was worse. Rebecca whispered. We didn't know. I looked at her. You knew enough. She flinched. You knew your daughter was afraid. Diane closed her eyes. You knew your daughter begged you. Rebecca started sobbing. You knew there were accusations. Thomas stared at the floor. You knew another adult warned you. Gregory wouldn't look at his wife. You all knew enough to ask one more question. Nobody answered. That asking questions might have meant admitting you were wrong. I returned to the canvas. So you chose the easier story? Problem child. Manipulative teenager. Difficult daughter. Professional treatment. Everything had a label. Labels were convenient. Dead children weren't. A phone vibrated on the table. All 4 parents looked toward it. I picked it up. One message. We're in. I exhaled. Diane noticed. What? Nothing yet. Who is Lena? I smiled. The part of the plan that doesn't involve you. Detective Lena Brooks had first contacted me 14 months earlier. She didn't know who I was. I mailed her a copy of an old missing person file connected to a former Red Hollow resident. Then another. Then another. Eventually she noticed the pattern. Teenagers sent to Red Hollow. Families told they had run away. Incomplete discharge records. Parents who hadn't physically seen their children leave. The oldest case was 13 years old. The newest was 7. Lena reopened 3 files. Quietly, I gave her more. She traced former employees. One counselor agreed to talk, then another. The stories matched: punishment, isolation, cover-ups, students removed from dorms at night, maintenance vehicles, the reservoir. Lena wanted my name. I refused, until 3 months ago. We met in a diner outside Salem. She expected an older man. When I sat across from her, she stared. You're the kid from the Whitaker file. Was. You survived Red Hollow. Yes. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I came to people like you 8 years ago. She didn't argue. That was when I decided to trust her. Not completely. Trust is a luxury, but enough. I gave her everything, except what I planned to do with the parents. She would have stopped me. She was supposed to. Thomas suddenly lunged against his restraints. The chair tipped. He crashed onto his side. Rebecca screamed. I walked over and set him upright. He tried to headbutt me. I stepped back. Sit still, you smug little bastard. Probably. You think you're some kind of hero. No, that shut him up. I stopped thinking that a long time ago. I loosened the strap around his shoulders slightly. Thomas looked surprised. You kidnapped 4 people. Yes. You terrorized us. Yes. You're going to prison. Possibly. Then what was the point? I looked at the painting. Getting you into one room, for what? To make you listen. You could have sent an email. I did. His expression changed. I smiled. People like you are very good at deleting emails. By sunset, the portrait was almost finished. The four parents finally understood why I hadn't painted them. 3 teenagers sat at the center of the canvas, Elise on the left, Brooke on the right, me between them. I painted us the way we had looked during our first summer at Red Hollow, Elise's hair pulled behind one ear, Brooke with the chipped black nail polish she refused to remove, me holding a sketchbook. Behind us stood the wooden Red Hollow administration building, beyond that, dark trees. But there were other figures in those trees, dozens, teenagers without detailed faces. Shapes disappearing into the forest. Diane stared at the canvas. You remember her, every day. You painted her exactly. I drew Elise hundreds of times. She started crying again. She used to draw too. I know. Diane looked at me. She never showed me. I know that too. Those words hurt her more than anything else I had said. Good. Or maybe not good. I wasn't sure anymore. My phone vibrated again. Lena. Call me, I answered. She didn't say hello. No, her voice sounded different. What? You were right. The room disappeared around me. For 8 years, I had imagined hearing those words. I had believed they would make me feel something enormous. Instead, I felt cold. How many? We don't know yet, Lena. At least 6. My hand tightened around the phone. Elise. A pause. We found personal facts consistent with 2 of the files. That's all I can tell you until identification, Brooke. No. Is she there? We don't know yet. I closed my eyes. Then Lena asked, where are you? I looked at the 4 parents. Finishing something. What does that mean? I'm sending you an address. Noah. They're alive. Silence. Who? The Parkers and Callahans. Her voice sharpened instantly. What did you do? Nothing permanent. Send me the address now. I will. No. Listen to me. I hung up. Thomas stared at me. Police. Yes. Coming here? Yes. Rebecca let out a long breath. Diane didn't move. Gregory asked, what did they find? I looked at him. People. He went pale. How many? Enough. Diane whispered Elise's name. I did not answer. Police arrived 27 minutes later. By then I had removed the restraints. Nobody tried to leave. That surprised me. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they knew there was nowhere meaningful left to go. Thomas rubbed his wrists. You could run. I already did that once. Sirens grew louder outside. Rebecca stood in front of the painting. She touched Brooke's painted face. I should have gone back. Nobody answered. I almost did. Thomas looked at her. She didn't look back. The night she called, I packed a bag. I put my keys in my purse. Her voice broke. I sat in the car for almost an hour. Thomas whispered, Becky, you told me if I went there, she'd learn she could manipulate me. He looked away. Rebecca stared at Brooke's face. So I went back inside. The first police vehicle entered the lot, then another. Diane came toward me. She stopped several feet away. Did Elise hate me? There are questions people ask because they want the truth, and questions they ask because they want mercy. This was both. I could have lied. I had lied many times to bring them here. Instead, I told her what I remembered. She wanted you. Diane's mouth trembled, even at the end. Yes, that destroyed her. She covered her face. For a moment, I saw Elise sitting beside me on the dormitory floor, carefully dividing a granola bar into 3 pieces. She had always saved the biggest piece for someone else, even when she had almost nothing. The door to the studio burst open. Police shouted, hands visible. On the floor, don't move. I did exactly what they asked. For once, following instructions felt easy. The Red Hollow investigation lasted almost 2 years. The reservoir search uncovered remains belonging to multiple former residents. Some deaths had occurred before I arrived, some after I escaped. Red Hollow's official records described several of them as runaways, others supposedly returned home. The paperwork had been falsified. Dr. Malcolm Voss was arrested 3 weeks after the search began. Derek Shaw disappeared before investigators reached his house. For 9 months, nobody knew where he was. Eventually, he was found living under another name in Nevada. I learned that from a newspaper in jail. Thomas Callahan resigned before charges related to his conduct could be reviewed. Whether what he had done was criminal became a complicated legal argument. What he had done as a father was simpler. Gregory Parker filed for divorce 6 months after the studio. Diane never returned to teaching. Rebecca Callahan attended every hearing connected to Red Hollow. I saw her once. She sat 3 rows behind me. We didn't speak. The state charged me with 4 counts of unlawful imprisonment, kidnapping, drugging, and several other things my attorney explained repeatedly. I accepted a plea. People online argued about me. Some called me a survivor. Some called me a vigilante. Some called me insane. One podcast called me the Red Hollow Painter. I hated that one the most. Everyone wanted the story to have a hero. They wanted me to be one, or Lena, or Brooke. They wanted Dr. Voss to be a monster from the beginning and every parent to be evil. That would make the story comfortable. But Red Hollow did not survive for years because one monster built a fence in the mountains. It survived because adults believed difficult children deserved difficult solutions. Because parents wanted experts to fix problems they didn't understand. Because employees needed paychecks. Because local officials liked donations. Because complaints were inconvenient. Because teenagers are easy to discredit. Because frightened children don't always tell stories cleanly. Because sometimes they swear. Sometimes they lie about small things. Sometimes they break rules. Sometimes they are angry. Sometimes they are exhausting. And adults decide that means they cannot be telling the truth about anything. Red Hollow lived inside that gap. The distance between my child is difficult and my child is in danger. Brooke understood that before I did. If one of us gets out, we tell everyone. I used to think I had kept my promise. Now I'm not sure. Maybe promises like that don't end. 3 years after my arrest, Detective Lena Brooks visited the evidence facility where the police had stored property from the case. I know this because she told me later. Most of the Red Hollow evidence had already been catalogued. Boxes, hard drives, old staff files, photographs. My painting had been placed against the back wall, wrapped in protective material. Lena asked to see it. The evidence technician removed the covering. 3 teenagers appeared beneath the fluorescent lights. Elise, me, Brooke. Behind us stood Red Hollow. And behind Red Hollow were all the others. Lena told me she looked at it for nearly 10 minutes before noticing something. At the very bottom of the painting, beneath several layers of dark paint, I had written 4 words. Small enough that you had to stand close. She photographed them. Months later she mailed the photograph to me. I kept it in my cell for a long time. 4 words, not for the Parkers, not for the Callahans. Not for Dr. Voss. For anyone who looked at a frightened teenager and decided the easier explanation must be the true one. For anyone who heard "please help me" and waited for better evidence. For anyone who believed a child had to be perfect before they deserved to be believed. For words, we told you, and you didn't listen.